So I think it's more of an issue of having to change the mindset from music is a luxury, music is a nice to have. We don't really see how music is going to, help people get jobs to, music is a fundamental way of how humans communicate with each other, how we bond, how we build community. And in order to be part of a flourishing human community, we should have exposure to music as children so that we can participate in that conversation later on, and reap all the benefits that music can give our species.
It's so great to meet you here on Zoom, Indre.
Yeah, you too.
Where are you based?
Right now in San Francisco, but in 48 hours we're in Paris for the year.
Oh, I see. Okay. And um, I would love to talk to you about your two passions, science and music. And what are you going to do? I mean, do you still sing?
I do occasionally when it sort of matches with a concert or some kind of a
Okay.
presentation that I'm giving. So, often it's part of a demonstration. I still do some chamber music. So I have a group of chamber musicians that I perform with. And generally, the performances involve some element of the neuroscience side of my personality too.
Oh, really? So, but what came first, the science or the music as a child? I just,
Yeah.
what came first,
You know,
the
I I
music?
uh, I would say, I mean, music. Yeah, so music was always part of my upbringing. So some of my first memories involve lying under my mom's baby grand piano in our living room while she was conducting choir rehearsals for her choirs. So she's a conductor, and she's, conducted choirs for my entire life. And so from the time I was a child, she encouraged me to have a solid music education. And then when I got to high school, I found that science was really interesting to me and it was something that I could excel at. So it was really since high school that I sort of started to pursue both careers or both fields, with gusto.
But it's for me so interesting because uh, when I started my project here, I spoke to musicians that in the time they were all in lockdown. And I actually spoke to a conductor who was studying medicine. And in his final year, he just decided, no, his passion is music, and he ended up studying conducting. And initially, this idea of somebody so deep in the sciences, then suddenly, wanting to be a musician or wanting to be a conductor, I couldn't, I didn't realize how close the science and music, or the sciences and art, is connected.
Yeah, so I actually have a very similar story. When I was an undergraduate, I got a scholarship to study psychology at the University of Toronto, and but I continued to train my voice and be very much involved in the musical community. And then when it was time for me to choose what to do next, I had a offer to do a PhD at UCLA in cognitive neuroscience, but I wanted to spend a year immersed in the opera world. So I actually moved to London and worked as an usher at the Royal Opera House, where I could see opera 6 nights a week and I could study with some of the coaches. And it was there that I was told, you have a big lyric voice. It's going to take a few more years to develop. You need to keep working on this. And I had felt that, well, if I'm going to spend the next 4 or 5 years working on something, I might as well also get a PhD out of the
Wow.
project. And so to me, the PhD was essentially a 5 year project where I thought, this is what's going to help me get to the next stage in my career, whatever that might be. And so in the last year of my PhD, I was cast as the Countess in La Nozze di Figaro in a production with orchestra in Italy. And it was my first time singing with orchestra. And I will never forget during the dress rehearsal when the orchestra began, I just thought I never want to do anything else. So I finished my dissertation within 3 months and essentially left science and went and did a master's in voice performance. And then for the next 10 years, spent time primarily as a gigging singer and then eventually as a stage director and living the life of a professional artist. And it was in that time especially when I was doing the master's, that I recognized that so much of the neuroscience of learning and memory hadn't trickled down to how musicians were being trained and how they were approaching their own practice. And so I started working with a couple of my, colleagues, and then I developed a course called Training the Musical Brain for the Conservatory in San Francisco, and it became incredibly popular. In fact, a number of the graduating students said that of all the classes that they took outside of their studio classes, this was the one that was most impactful for their careers. And so that's where I started to see, oh, you know what? There is this bridge that I can build between neuroscience and artistic performance that really I was uniquely equipped, uniquely qualified to build, and that it could actually be really helpful for people.
But it actually makes sense, and I don't think we always realize it. But if you take sport, for instance, you work with sport or sport men and women. They work with scientists, sports scientists, to be able to, get them on top of the game or to enhance their performance. But yet there's not something like that for musicians always, or you don't think that it's necessary. You think just practice, 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 but you have to do it in the right way then.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that I think there's been a lot of history of a kind of apprenticeship learning model, especially in classical music training. And there is a reluctance to be open to new ideas from a person who's outside of the field. So, say a scientist. And it's hard, it's more subjective. Like, how do you measure whether someone is playing a Chopin piece better or worse? You can't just time them. You can't just, in sports, there can be an objective measure, like are they running faster, are their muscles stronger, are they breathing harder, et cetera. In music, there's more of a subjectivity. So in that sense, there's I think a bit of a natural skepticism towards these objective measures or what scientists might be able to bring to something that has this long history. There's also the financial consideration that the vast majority of musicians don't make a livable wage out of performing. And that is true for a large number of athletes, but often athletes are in programs or situations that are well funded. Whereas musicians tend to be independent contractors. They tend to be sort of left to their own devices. And certainly, for an orchestra, for example, you wouldn't, maybe some of the top orchestras do, but in most cases, you wouldn't have a whole team of coaches that are interested in individual performance by the players. They're interested in the orchestra's performance and, those kinds of organizational things. But in a basketball team, for example, you're going to have a whole series of, coaches and medical professionals that understand that if each individual isn't healthy, the team can't play. So I think there's a financial consideration there in terms of how compensation happens. So that means that musicians have to pay out of pocket for these services. And, as we all know, musicians generally are not super well paid. Unless you're a musician, like Beyonce or Taylor Swift, or, super, super popular, and you're making tons of money, I guarantee you they have performance coaches. They have, they will have people that are going to make sure that they are performing at their peak level at all times, because they can afford to have it. And so that's, I think that's part of the issue. I don't think it's a matter of there not being people that are interested in working with musicians. There are lots of people that are interested in working with musicians. And I don't think it's a lack of interest on the musician's part necessarily either. I just think it's this disconnect between how musicians are compensated and how people who want to work with them, also are professionals and, also need to be compensated for the work that they do.
But it's interesting now that you say that, because I also spoke to a dance scientist, and we talked about this idea of that dance and ballet, specifically ballet, is so set in this way of training, set in this way of, we do it this way, we did it this way, and so the next generation has to do it the next way. Yet there's so much into dance and so much into the physical, the science behind this as well. So do you think it's also in the music industry like this, where you say they are open for it, but that we sort of just think about, oh, this is a talented musician, rather than thinking there is also a possibility that somebody might not be doing it exactly the right way, but that there can be more performance out of them if they did it the right way, or there's something that hinders them that could be solved by looking at the science behind it.
I mean, absolutely. I think that there is again, and I think there is a big difference between musical training in the classical conservatory model or classical music training and other forms of music training that are maybe more organic, less structured, less formalized. So, people who are often jazz musicians will apprentice for a long time and just gig and play. Pop singers who, sometimes in the classical music world, we kind of just think of classical music as the pinnacle. But the truth is that the vast majority of musicians out there are not classically trained. They are, they are in the pop world. They put together a band and so on. And so I think that, in that case, there is a lot of openness, especially in music education. Teachers who are, putting together a series of rock bands, for example, for their students, they will be open to some of the principles involved in ensuring that kids are motivated and they want to, do the work and so on. So, for example, the emphasis is not on perfection. The emphasis is on expression. And right from the first lesson, the student is listened to and told to, play what's coming out of them, as opposed to having to train for many years before you even get the chance to choose the piece that you actually want to play, which is more of the classical model, right? Where, oh no, you have to establish all of these skills and then you get to choose how you play and what you play. But until then, usually the emphasis is on the teacher will tell you what to play, how to play, etc. And I think that that's, I think that that's ingrained. I also think it needs to change. I mean, we're seeing a decline in people going to, a lot of classical music events. A number of orchestras are successful and their audiences have rebounded from the pandemic. And an equal number of orchestras are either in financial dire straits or have closed as a result of that pandemic. So, I think that there is a change that needs to happen, and I do think that there are a large number of really well qualified, caring, very smart, very open music teachers, even within the classical music world at the university level, the conservatory level. But there is also a long history, and in many departments, there are people who very much feel that it's their way or the highway, and that they have built up this body of knowledge over the decades and they know how to do it. And I think that that's problematic, because I think that also is built on this previously viable model, which is that, okay, if you have a number of students and you train them in this way and they're able to play the way that you feel is the right way to play, it used to be that they could go out and get jobs in orchestras or at opera companies and so on. And that's just not the case anymore. There are far fewer jobs available now. And so I think that as the workplace for classical musicians has changed, so too must their teachers adapt. And sometimes I see that adaptation is happening too slowly. And students are often, getting a lot of school debt, and especially in the US, where these programs are very, very expensive. And then they're left saddled with this huge loan that they need to repay just at the time when they should be able to, not have to worry about money so much as they're trying to make their way as a professional musician.
Mm. That's true. And do you think in schools that it's happening that art and science are so disconnected, that they use music as just recreational rather than I mean you've studied all the benefits of playing music or listening to music, so that should be really part of the curriculum, and it should be alongside all the sciences and maths and languages.
It's very interesting too. We also are seeing an economic divide in that the schools that are well funded, especially private schools where, parents might come from wealthier backgrounds or, the parents themselves are wealthier, those schools have music programs, or at least they have the opportunity where the students, can access music education. It's the public schools, it's the schools where there isn't as much funding that the emphasis seems to have gone towards STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and where music programs are cut and are seen as, something that is easily pulled from the budget without, harming the education of the students. And we're just finding that that's not the case. There are a lot of reasons why music education is useful for children, and it's particularly useful for kids that are coming from less privileged backgrounds because they don't have access at home to the same kind of musical education opportunities. And they often come from, for example, environments that are very noisy or that have a lot of chaos and so on. And in fact, music education enhances a person's ability to hear speech and noise, for example. It enhances a person's ability to focus. It enhances executive functioning skills that are very much in decline in the youth of today. And so, I wrote this, as you mentioned, I wrote a white paper designed for policymakers and educators and parents and teachers to demonstrate that the music education isn't just about giving people more culture or, more kind of well-rounded education. It really fundamentally is a very powerful tool to help build the kinds of skills that help people get things done. And those are very important in the workplace. So, I totally agree that music education should be the every child's right. It should be part of the curriculum. And I don't think it needs to take away, for example, from math or writing or any of the other tools. I think it can be integrated within the existing school day.
Exactly.
And in fact, there's
Yeah.
some beautiful studies that show that if you take some time even away from the regular school day to engage in some music education, those students do better on the other subjects as well because they're better able to focus, they are better able to regulate, they have all these other skills that actually help them deal with the other sort of maybe to some parents and superintendents and teachers more important quote skills of reading, writing, math. So yes, I think that's what we're starting to see through the work that we're doing, and I'm a lot of the work that I do now is really about educating the public about these kinds of uses of music. I think up until now, we've sort of thought of music as one thing. It's just, it's sort of, I call it like the sledgehammer approach, where it's like music is just music and it's separate. And I like to think of music more as a Swiss Army knife, where it has a number of different possible tools, a number of different uses. And so, you can use music in the classroom to help kids learn the alphabet. You can use music in the classroom to help them reset after coming in from recess. You can use music in the classroom to help them, learn a new set of basic facts and foundations. And we can use music to reset our own, rhythms and decrease anxiety and enhance relaxation or ramp us up for a workout, get us ready for the big speech that we have to make. So understanding how music can be used as a tool, I think, is a different approach than just saying, well, music is this thing and you only use it in certain circumstances. I really feel like music is useful everywhere,
Exactly.
but not in the same way for everyone. So there, it's the other this idea that okay, we can just play classical music in airports and everybody will be happy. doesn't work because for some people, classical music, triggers all kinds of feelings that maybe we don't want to trigger at the airport. And classical music, for example, like for me personally, solo piano music, I just can't stand it unless it's like,
Really?
I'm able to sit down and listen to like, Rachmaninoff
Yeah.
or Chopin. But if it's just playing in the background, I can't find it really irritating. So I think that that's where, understanding, how music affects us and also that it doesn't affect us in the same way over time. So you might listen to a piece of music and not like it the first time, but the fifth time you hear it, it might become one of your favorite pieces ever because you've now
Right.
understood it more. You now hear things differently. And the opposite can be true too. Your favorite album, if you listen to it, excessively, can start to get irritating after the 10th, 11th, 12th listen in a row. And now you need that variety and you need that change. And the same is true over the course of a day. In the morning, you might prefer one kind of music, and in the afternoon, another.
Mhm. And it's also, yeah, this emotional attachment that we make to music. I've also found that sometimes I listen to something that I've listened to as a child, and suddenly I listen to it with a different ear, but it's just because of my experience over the time.
Hmm. Yeah, that's right. And, you're probably bringing back memories of that music is triggered from things that happened to you and as a child. But you're also a different person now. Your brain is fundamentally different. It does change over our lifespan with our experience. And so you might hear things in it that you hadn't heard before. You might also not it might not be as lovely as it was before because now maybe your, tastes have become more sophisticated or you want more complexity or they just changed. And
Definitely.
I think that that's also something that we need to recognize that, music should be a companion, I think, throughout our lifespan, but that doesn't mean that it's the same music that we need to listen to over the course of our lives.
Mhm. But I spoke to somebody. I can't remember his name now, but he revived or he's part of this group. They are reviving the lyra, the ancient Greek lyra, and
Mm,
I had an interview with him. We talked about the lyra and the how easy it is really to play the lyra.
mm,
He said that in ancient Greece, if you couldn't play the lyra, you were seen as uneducated, and
mm,
children used to go to school with the lyra. And
mm,
this made me think, well, isn't it amazing that there was a time really where everybody played an instrument or played the lyra or some must have been some other instrument as well, but that music was so important in that time.
And I don't think it's that far away. I mean, I grew up in Canada, and in my public elementary school, when you got to third grade, everybody had to play the recorder. Everybody.
Me
And then
too.
when you
Yeah,
got to
with
fourth
us.
grade,
Yeah,
you had to choose an instrument. I mean, it wasn't a choice.
yeah.
It wasn't like you got to choose which instrument, but the
Mm,
choice of choosing an instrument or not was not there. It was part of the curriculum. And this was public school. It wasn't some fancy private school. So I do think that we have lost that, but it hasn't been that long. And I think
yeah,
now it's time to sort of bring that back, especially when you have such a large number of music students who have graduated with music degrees and now don't have jobs in their field. I think so. There's a workforce that's really ready to be deployed, even though teaching music to kids is a very different skill from playing music yourself. But I think within a year or two, you could bring those musicians up to speed in terms of what are the best practices, and maybe they'll discover something new as well. And at the same token, it's never been less expensive to produce musical instruments. So I think that
exactly
with
true. Yeah,
yeah, like you've got, my child plays the violin, and there are these excellent instruments that are coming out of China that are very affordable. And so, it's just not as hard to get access to these and that's like the classical music instruments. I mean, drums, voice, I mean, those are essentially free because we come with the instrument to the classroom.
exactly.
And so, I think it's more of an issue of having to change the mindset from music is a luxury, music is a nice to have. We don't really see how music is going to, help people get jobs to, music is a fundamental way of how humans communicate with each other, how we bond, how we build community. And in order to be part of a flourishing human community, we should have exposure to music as children so that we can participate in that conversation later on, and reap all the benefits that music can give our species.
Absolutely. I spoke to a conductor of a youth orchestra, and we half of the interview was about all the advantages that being part of an orchestra, this whole idea of not just the music, but the companionship, all the collaboration with other children, all the advantages that brings. And I never also realized that, but it's the same in choirs as well. It's that group of people coming together, or children then, also coming together, working towards something specifically.
Yeah, so, in the case of the orchestra, I think we often recognize how team sports can give children all kinds of skills of, how to be part of a group and how to build, relationships with others and so forth. And the orchestra is like the team sport on steroids. I mean, because you have to
Really?
listen, you have to adapt, you have to, play together, you have to work together. So I think that is undervalued in the sense that of that element of it. But when it comes to the choral singing, I mean, the science really is very, very rich in terms of what we're learning about the benefits of choral singing. I've just completed a study that we're writing up now for publication of the impact of a massive choral festival in Lithuania last year. It was a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Song Festival, which is a UNESCO Cultural Heritage event. And it brings together 12,000 singers into
Wow.
one choir. So it's not like they're coming and just each singing for each other. They're singing as a choir, and they learn, a 4-hour concert repertoire, and they sing it together. And we found really compelling data showing that participating in the event shows measurable increases in well-being, in self-esteem, in collective self-esteem, in membership self-esteem, so feeling like you are a valuable member of a group, in valuing cultural heritage, all of these really important features of social connectedness were enhanced in the participants. And we are also at the same time going through a loneliness epidemic, where people feel isolated. And so essentially the choral singing is an antidote to one of the major problems that we face in terms of our health and in terms of our society. So, I think we are, it's really kind of underestimated the power that singing in a choir has, and that's something that you can teach kids from preschool onwards. And so, having that experience, I think, is really fundamental to our education.
And also on a social level, I also spoke with a opera singer who comes from the Western Cape in South Africa, no, the Eastern Cape, and very poor environment, very sort of as like the rural part also. But there was a choir, and he said that if it wasn't for this choir, I mean, he wouldn't have been an opera singer now. He's in Europe, in Germany, I think. And but he's talking about that, keeping him off the streets, giving him this discipline, belonging to something apart from, not belonging to a gang, but belonging to the choir, and having people to look up to, the older choir members and all of that. So he sees the choir actually as saving his life in a way, or giving him the possibility to go on and become an opera singer.
I mean, I believe that, and I think that is something that choirs can do. There's so many other benefits too. They help people with dementia. They help the caregivers of people with dementia. There's a number of choirs now that are being formed for people with dementia and their caregivers. There's a great organization called Music Men's Minds that does this in many different cities around the world. And you're exactly right that, and that's one of the reasons that the Song Festival in Lithuania, for example, continued is because even when Lithuania was occupied by the Soviet Union, it was an act of resistance to sing in a choir and to continue these traditions. And it gave people a sense that they are not alone. And so there's some historical, surveys or theories that look at these kinds of major singing events as one of the reasons that the Soviet Union crumbled. It's the singing revolution. Essentially it gave people the strength to resist and carry on. And so I think it has power well beyond just the form of entertainment that we generally, relegate it to.
But do you think it's also it's this catch-22 situation really, because parents, you want your children to have the best education, you want them to have the best possibility for work or for a job, and then everybody's talking about the suffering artist, and there's no work as a musician, but that sort of stigma also in schools, then the pressure from the parents to have this education is actually hindering the children, and that there should be this more openness about what the benefits are of playing an instrument or being part of or even just some form of art that children can express themselves.
I think one of the issues is that nowadays, at least in the US primarily, there is this pressure that if you're you need to find what your child is good at or what their passion is, and then they need to pursue that to the highest level. So, and so like, if you have a kid who shows a little bit of a love for soccer, for example, they get at 4, they're put on the little micro soccer team. By 6 or 7, the soccer team now practices 2 to 3 times a week and has games on the weekend. And, now the parents have to, spend all this money on uniforms, and, it becomes like this competitive, thing where, well, if you're going to do soccer, you have to do it at this incredibly high level. And same thing with music. So then they think, well, but, maybe my child isn't going to be a concert violinist. So why should I, pay for all of these lessons and put all this time in? I think we've lost the feeling that sometimes for kids, it's just good to try a whole bunch of things. And that doesn't mean they need to be the best ballet dancer, the gymnast, the soccer player, the violinist. Just dabbling, being an amateur, just getting exposure to these different types of activities is really, really powerful and important. But I think the way that the extracurricular model works, and there's a lot of demands put on parents these days, but often they also are working and trying to organize all these things. So, I think that's what as a parent myself, that's one of the things that I'm noticing is that it seems like, just for the kids to get a little bit of exposure, you have to kind of buy in all the way into the activity. There isn't just, oh, once a week you can play basketball with your friends in the gym. It's like, no, if you want to be on the basketball team, here's the practice schedule, and you can't do this and that and the other thing. And, my child, she's 6, and since she was 4, she was part of the, music program at the Conservatory of Music in San Francisco, which is where I taught and where I got my degree. And, by age 6 or 7, they basically tell the parents, like, you're going to have to choose whether your child is going to be involved in soccer or if they're going to continue on with us. I don't know. At 6 or 7, exactly. I don't know, right? No. But they're right, because there's too many conflicts. If you have to do your Saturday music lessons, that conflicts with your Saturday soccer games. And so now you have to make these choices. And, I think that that's part of the problem, is that it used to be that all of these activities were encased in the school day, where, either the school provided them or provided access to them. It wasn't this thing where parents had to, at 2:30 leave work, take their child, bring them to this lesson, and then take them to that lesson. And it just becomes this whole thing. So yeah, I think that the what I see is this respect for amateurism is somehow like seen as lesser than. Like if your child is just maybe a little good at something, like somehow that's a failure, as opposed to seeing it as, well, you're actually creating a well-rounded child by exposing them to all of these different elements. And it's okay if they don't become a professional athlete or musician or, computer coder, like who cares? It's just that they're getting this exposure and it's part of their development rather than a means to an end. I mean, that's kind of what I see now. A lot of these extracurricular activities are kind of a means to an end. And children have to choose very early what they're going to specialize in because, to get into a good college, it's not good enough to say, I played soccer with my buddies on Saturday afternoons. You have to say, I
Yeah.
was on the elite soccer team and we traveled across Europe and, played, all this kind of stuff. That seems somehow more impressive. And, I think that's really sad.
Yeah, and I also, it was just a conversation I had with a mum one time, and she said that her child used to play the violin, but she had to stop because to get into the secondary school, your maths, and to get into a good secondary school, your maths and your science marks have to be very high and good, and so there's no time to play the violin. And I thought, how sad is that? The focus is so on the maths and science just to get into a school, and yet you think not how many children become scientists and mathematicians. This is
And
it's
yeah, I mean, and the irony, of course, now is, I did university level calculus and I had to do all these algebra things. If you ask me right now to derive an equation, I could not for the life of me do it. I
really.
have no recollection of how to do that anymore because I don't use it. And I'm a scientist and I work with science and I use statistical tools and, I understand it. And if I need to understand, I know how to look for it. But the truth is that so many of those maths and even some science skills that you learn in elementary school and high school, you never use again, even if you are in that profession. And yet, I would want to say to that mom, like, honestly, playing the violin will improve her math scores. It will improve her critical
Yeah.
thinking because it will teach her how to get through, the grit and the resilience that you need in order to learn something hard, learn something new. And, the pattern recognition and the pattern matching, which is so much more important than just the pure calculation that so much math curriculum in elementary school is all about. It's just about like doing 30 more problems of the same problem. That takes time, but that's not what people do outside the world, in the world afterwards. And, doing 10 problems and then spending the next 20 minutes pattern recognition and understanding music theory and learning the violin and getting it into your fingers is going to be far more useful later on in life when you have to solve problems on the fly, when you have to be thinking creatively and innovatively and not just doing the same recipe over and over and over again.
The word transferable skills is so popular used in the corporate world. And this is actually what you're talking about. It's that, by playing an instrument, you have these skills that you take onto whatever you do later in life.
Exactly. And in fact, I think it was Steve Jobs that said, or maybe it was Steve Wozniak, one of the major Apple, foundational CEOs was saying that every really great engineer that it has a creative spark plays a musical instrument that they've met. That, every sort of really creative thinker has a musical background of some kind, and that makes a lot of sense to me because that is one of the elements that we learn about in music. But it also gives you all of these other, as you mentioned, transferable skills, which I call executive functioning skills. Learning to focus, learning to switch between tasks, learning to, understand that sometimes it's not obvious how you can develop a skill, but you need to continue to work at it, and then all of a sudden, you get there. The resilience, the grit, the ability to handle rejection and failure, which is also really important.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of, students are, they get very anxious when they're criticized or when they make a mistake. And that's not how innovation happens. That's not what you do in the workplace. You have to understand you can't just not make mistakes. You understand that if you make a mistake, you will know how to go back and correct it, how to solve for it, how to learn from it, how to grow from it, rather than just trying to avoid mistakes, which means that you stay in a very safe, predictable zone all the time, which is really, then anybody can do your job, right? That's not going to make you an employee that is very valuable to the company because you're replaceable. But if you're the person that, can, take a risk, can learn from the mistake, can then, enhance your work, you're going to be much more valuable to the company and they won't be able to replace you.
Exactly. But where do you think personally should your work be, or the neuroscience, the latest neuroscience, the results be put in schools, with parents, or with companies? Where do you think it's needed that they hear what the results are?
So I think it's at all levels, and that's partly why a lot of the work that I do kind of has a whole bunch of different tiers. So some of the work I do is with corporations, so with some of the big, four accounting firms, with major, very large organizations, and I help them understand creativity in the workplace, the role of music in the workplace, and how they can ready their employees for the coming changes that are, here already with all of these Gen AI tools and so on, and create a resilient workforce. And I think that a lot of the work that artists do, I mean, have to be resilient, or else they're gonna leave the profession, right? Because you have much more failure than you have success when you're being creative. By definition, it hasn't been done before. So we can learn from artists and their approach to resilience to help employees and even very large corporations with, very strict hierarchies, how they can be resilient to the changes that are coming into the workplace now. So starting with the corporate level, but at the same time, working with universities. So universities are going through a huge change now, trying to understand, like, how do you teach in an era where everybody has access to these new AI tools? What are the important skills that we need to teach? And so, I have a couple of projects that I'm working with colleagues on, which is understanding when to use these Gen AI tools. For example, during the writing process, is it during the idea generation phase, or when you're editing your essay, for its final, grammatical or stylistic components? When are the tools useful? When are they harmful? When do they lead to better outcomes for the students, both in terms of their initial product, the essay that they're handing in, but also long term, over the course of, learning how to be critical thinkers. So there's work in that space. And then, of course, in education, the idea is that, I've had these conversations with educators when I've talked to them about the neuroscience of creativity, and they've said, "Oh, it's so great that we know so much about, how the brain is creative and what are the different elements involved in being creative and how we can set up students for success." But I'm not going to take that into the classroom because it's not what my superintendent cares about. It's not what my principal cares about. It's not what my parents care about, because it's not going to help the kids get into college. And so then we started working with the colleges, and we showed them that, if you have a more creative applicant, they actually do better in college. They're more likely to get a higher GPA. They're more likely to graduate. So if colleges can screen for creativity, and we're sort of helping them develop the tools to do that, then the parents, the students, the superintendents, the principals, and the high schools will start to care. And if they start to care, that's going to trickle down to the elementary schools. And so all of a sudden, and everybody's now talking about how, in this new AI revolution, human creativity is going to be really even more important than it has been in the past. And so I feel like it's a ripe moment. I feel like this is the time, and I'm working very hard as the president of the Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity, but also as a science communicator, to really inform the general public that not only, it might be nice to say creativity is really important, but we know a lot about how creativity works, when it flourishes, when it fails, what we need to do to train people to be more creative, how we can support students who want to be creative. And so having more of a translational impact of the work that we're doing And telling teachers and corporations and universities, like, you're not alone in this. It's not on you to figure out the whole creativity piece. There's a whole society of researchers that have been doing this for the last decade, and we've learned a lot. So, it's worth having these conversations.
Well, can you imagine a university putting on their application that you have to have you have to have a musical instrument, or you have to be able to play or sing, or anything like that? That would then spiral down to bring all the schools up to implement that in the schools.
Yeah, and exactly, and that's essentially what we are doing. So we've developed a tool that helps universities track creativity and application essays. So it essentially automatically scores application essays for elements of human creativity within them. So not just that is the essay written in a creative fashion, but does the essay demonstrate that this individual engages in creative behavior, that they have a history of, working with the arts or playing musical instrument, et cetera. And what we've shown these universities is that this is very predictive. It's just as predictive almost as the SAT, which is the current standardized test that universities often use to decide who they want to let into their universities. And not only that, but it's not as much tied to socioeconomic status as the SAT. So you can, find students who normally wouldn't necessarily do well in the SAT, but would do well in your college because of what we see in their essays. So I think, we're already working on this. We already have some adoption by some top universities who are using the tool for their application essays. And, I think we're just about to publish some results on that. And we hope that this will start to gain some traction with the media. And so, like, if parents start to realize,
Mhm.
oh, this is something that will help my kid get into college, hopefully that will start the trickle down effect.
Mhm. But that's amazing, and this will also give children who would otherwise not have, like you say, sometimes you have not the right marks to get into university, but you are the ideal student, or you are the one with the work ethic because of this artistic background that you have.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. And I think, students might not get good grades in school for a number of reasons. It could be that their parents moved around a lot, that there was, that they came from a war-torn place, or they were dealing with some kind of trauma, which doesn't mean that they're not going to do well in college. So I feel like we are equipping the universities with an additional tool that allows them to, really not only find the right candidates, but also find the candidates that normally would be overlooked. And I'm very proud of that aspect of the work.
Well, this is amazing. I mean, this is so hopeful that, that I think, because also over lockdown and talking to a lot of artists, I've always wondered why art is not valued more, because you think over the lockdown period, everybody reverted to art. Now everybody started doing something in some form of art, even if it's not, we listen to music, we watch films. There was always some sort of artistic endeavor, and that made me wonder why it's when everything was stripped away, when everything was taken away from us, what was the instinctive thing we did was to start creating.
And I think although the pandemic had a physical lockdown and a physical change that made us have to pivot, these AI tools are going to do the same thing through the workplace. So a lot of the jobs that we thought of as being secure and safe, that's also going to be overturned. And I really do believe that that's going to lead people back to their own creativity, their self-expression, because if everybody has access to these AI tools, there's going to be a kind of, there's going to be a return to average effect. And so how do you distinguish yourself from others when everybody can access these tools? It's no longer just about building a knowledge base or, et cetera. What's going to distinguish you, is your unique self-expression.
Sure.
And that's really at the core of what an artist is and does, is finds that thing inside of them that is unique and then expresses it in a way that has a universal impact. And I think that that's really going to be much more important, much more cherished. And my hope is that we really do start to turn to our artistic selves, to artists around us who have learned to do this over time very well, and that will increase the value that society places on the subjective nature of artistic expression.
What was so interesting for me is over the past year, I've noticed that every time I speak to a musician or singers, they would, and singer-songwriters as well, there's a lot of talk about the authenticity and a lot of talk about, I want to express myself my way, or I want to find my voice, or I want to be more authentic. And I think it's this, I thought of it as everybody's scared of AI, and what it can do in the world. But I think what it actually does is doing this, is
Yeah.
is letting people realize that, what, I can bring something that AI can't, or that's a little bit more unique and special.
Yeah, exactly. It's essentially creating a mirror for us where we can start to see our own humanity, and we can start to pull off the things that are less human about us, or less distinctive, and instead focus hopefully on the things that matter. I mean, look, I'm not, there are a lot of potential pitfalls that are coming down the line with the job loss and the economic potential consequences, and so on. And I don't want to diminish that, but I also, feel that there is an opportunity here and there is room for hopefulness. And if we approach it that way, and we have our ethics and our integrity intact, then we can see this as a really positive step in towards a more flourishing, a more a life that is meaningful. But it takes work. It's not something that we can do passively or that we can just allow to happen. Because as we've seen, with kids who grew up with smartphones in their hands, we were, pretty passive about allowing them access to these social media tools, and that has really backfired. We have seen the negative impacts on their mental health, on their ability to socialize, on their ability to, get things done, and so on. So we can't make the same mistake with these AI tools and just be complacent and passive and, not think about, how we're using them and what impact that has on us.
I have so much faith in humanity because I think we just, we realize things very quickly. Before the interview, I spoke to my daughter. I told her about there's a movement in America. I can't remember exactly where it is, where parents started buying landlines again, the normal telephones for their children to speak on. And I think it's wonderful, take away the mobile phone and give them just a normal phone to speak on. So, so I have my faith in humanity.
Me too.
But Indre, just tell me, what are your wishes for the future? What is the dream?
So my dream is that we live in a world where people have a greater access to the things that they need. So we are not resource poor. We are resource rich in terms of, the things that we need, and that we can leverage these tools to help us get there. And that then carves out time and space for us to find connection between each other, to make every moment more meaningful, to really recognize that humanity is not about being isolated or, just being, better than or climbing some ladder. Instead, that it is about making connection and finding each other, and then also at the same time finding our unique voices and being able to bring that unique self-expression to all of the aspects of our lives, whether it be at work, in the family home, on vacation, or in our hobbies. So that's my hope for the future, is that we can essentially figure out what our values are, and really live within those values, as opposed to always feeling like we are just being, shuffled around by the ocean waves, and we really have no control over where we go.
But congratulations with the amazing work you're doing. I saw on LinkedIn as well, I read on your website, and wonderful. I mean, it's people like you that, brings hope in the world, that we think, okay, so there are solutions and there are people working to find these solutions.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And there truly are, and there's a whole wonderful movement that is, showing people the value of the arts in many different underestimated aspects of their lives, like their health and well-being and so on. And also, I think an interest in people generally as they start to reimagine what they should be doing with their time, understanding that being isolated and just being mean to each other is not the recipe towards help, a happy and meaningful life, but feeling empathy and connection is really of critical importance.
And let's hope that music and art can be just alongside the sciences and maths in schools as subjects.
Yeah, and I would say beyond hope, let's make it happen.
Exactly.
It's in our hands.
Exactly, yeah.